Welcome and thank you all for coming tonight. Tonight's presentation is Letters Home, Hastings World War II Vets in Their Own Words. This program is sponsored by the Friends of Leduc and Historic Hastings and the Hastings Pioneer Room. We would also like to thank the Minnesota Hastings Veterans Home for allowing us to use their facility. I want to let you know that this event wouldn't have been possible except for hundreds of hours of research and compilation by Shirley Dalaska, who's one of our readers right there. She collected and transcribed all these letters, which were originally published in the Hastings Gazette. When the servicemen would write home to their families, if the families were willing, they would share the letters by printing them in the paper. And while time constraints only allow us to read a few dozen of them, there are copies of the over 200 letters that will be available here at the Vets Home, at the Hastings Pleasant Hill Library, at the Dakota County Historical Society, and at the Pioneer Room. And let me introduce you to our volunteer readers, and then we'll get started. We have Shirley Dalaska. We have Father Martin Siebenaler in the front row. We have Jan Dieter. We have Mayor Paul Hicks. In the back row, we have Steve Bloomstrand, Frank LaBreck, Andy Hill, and Dwight Smith, and myself, Cindy Thury Smith. And without further ado, we're going to start with Father Martin Siebenaler. Yep.
Okay, this one is from Hastings Gazette, January 9th, 1942. Letters Home, and this is what the Gazette wrote. Herb Eaton, formerly of Hastings, who saw service on the United States destroyer during World War I, is doing his bit again. Quote, for his grand and glorious country, and also to keep the name of Hastings on the map, just as we did in 1917. According to a Christmas letter Mr. Eaton wrote from Mount Vernon, Washington, the afternoon of December 24th to Charles M. Gear of Hastings, acting Dakota County engineer. Mr. Eaton's letter showing the surge of patriotism in his heart and the conditions on the Pacific coast since the Japanese bombing on December 7th is quoted in part, quote, I arrived from Alaska after a dangerous trip in waters where Jap submarines are lurking and at any moment the expectations of a Jap bomber over the horizon. But God seems to guide me through dangers, and so I expect to be on my way out in the Pacific where already 9 of our merchant ships have been bombed and torpedoed. But there is a vital need for seamen and serving the merchant marine. It is a patriotic job as serving in the Navy, so I feel I am doing my bit again. He continues, well, the Japs got in a few blows, and some were daring, we must admit, but desperation of a country, Japan, who is to save its face from the disgrace of defeat in China, will cause its men to perform many spectacular deeds of bravery in fighting a country that they cannot win over. In other words, Japan is committing national suicide. Of course, we will lose lives before this is over, but we must be loyal to our country and stand by our president 100%, regardless of political and personal opinions. And he quotes at the end, I am proud to serve in any capacity for my country and to die for it, end quote. Hastings Gazette, January 9th, 1942.
A few words about the Japanese internment camps. President Roosevelt signed an executive order in February of 1942 ordering the relocation of all Americans of Japanese ancestry to concentration camps in the interior of the United States. 10 camps were finally completed in remote areas of 7 western states. Housing was Spartan, and families dined together with Army-style grub. Many of the camps were named Little Tokyo.
In a letter from Lieutenant John P. Karpen, commanding officer at a Japanese relocation settlement in Grenada, Colorado, Lieutenant Karpen describes the camp as follows. This is a different phase of Army life. I don't think it was known in the First World War. The soldiers are here to guard what is known as Little Tokyo, in other words, a Japanese relocation settlement. There are about 7,000 Japanese in this government village. All live in barracks, each of which is divided into 6 apartments. In each block, there is a dining hall where all inhabitants of the block take their meals. The city has its own council and city officials who are interested in running a peaceful city. A 150-bed hospital is just being completed, and the contract for a school has just been let. This school will have about 20 classrooms, home economics department, automotive shop, blacksmith shop, and a large gymnasium. All work pertaining to the Japanese Center is handled by the War Location Authority. This group of government employees supervises the finances, building, maintenance, construction, landscaping, and issue passes to the Japanese. The escort guard company patrol the area, allowing no one to come or go without passes. The patrolling is night and day. In addition to its guard duty, the men of the company must be trained in all subjects pertaining to military life. This company consists of 140 men and 3 officers. It is fully armed and motorized. The company has its own area outside of the Jap Center, on which are 4 barracks buildings: recreation hall, company headquarters, building, mess hall, guardhouse, canteen, dispensary, and officers' quarters. On a 75-foot flagpole flies Old Glory, the most important and best loved factor in the camp. John P. Karpen, First Lieutenant, CMP, commanding the 335th MPEG Company. Hastings Gazette, November 27th, 1942.
A letter home from Private Bernard McCoy. Private Bernard McCoy writes in his first letter to his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Frank L. McCoy, from North Africa, that he likes the country awfully well. The natives are very friendly, Private McCoy said, and for a cigarette from the soldiers, they will exchange oranges the size of our largest grapefruit. Before going to Africa, Private McCoy, who is with the Medical Corps, was in England, leaving this country last October. His wife, the former Margaret McLeod, is a student at the University Farm School in Minneapolis. Hastings Gazette, February 26, 1943.
How much a soldier in active duty wishes for a good knife and how much he appreciates the spirit of the donor was shown this past week by a V-mail letter to Matt Karpen from a lieutenant in the armed forces somewhere in Australia who had received the prize hunting knife from Mr. Karpen. The knife was sent at a recent roundup of suitable knives in response to a plea from the fighting men for such weapons. Manufacturing facilities not being adequate on short notice, the word was sent out to sportsmen and others over the nation, and thousands of knives were contributed. Few conditions were imposed, but the knife must be a good one and have a blade at least 6 inches long. A letter of thanks from Lieutenant M.D. Magenheim of the U.S. Air Force is as follows. June 10, 1943. Mr. Matt Karpen, Chief of Police, Hastings, Minnesota. Dear Sir, that certainly is a nifty knife, Mr. Karpen, and I'm real proud to become the new possessor. The sheath is unusual and the envy of the men here. Hope we can add some Jap blood to the moose and deer blood already on the blade. Conditions on the front seem fairly well under control. Of course, we all feel the real big show here won't start until the European stage falls our way. Then, sir, watch our smoke. Meanwhile, we are worrying the ears off the Japs, and they are plenty unhappy. The Yanks and Aussies combine to add to their troubles. Before entering the Army, I was a teacher at the Florida State School for Boys. I understand the juvenile delinquents are proving to be the main headache of our police force these days, especially in war-boom cities. How has the war affected Hastings? Sure would be happy to hear from you sometime, Mr. Karpen, and may I take this means of thanking you for contributing such a swell knife to Uncle Sam's overseas nephews. Best regards to you. Sincerely, Lieutenant M.D. Magenheim, Air Corps. And then in parentheses it says, the sheath for the knife mentioned by Lieutenant Magenheim was handmade by Mr. Karpen out of moose hide, the moose being a victim of Matt's 3855. Printed in the Hastings Gazette, July 9th, 1943.
My father is Kenneth Match. He was stationed in Manchester, England. To have a famous spiral bridge suddenly appear on the screen at a movie show in England, a scene of my old hometown, was the experience of First Sergeant Kenneth Match while in Manchester, England. This is what he wrote to his mother, Mrs. L.B. Match, on October 10th of that year. No wonder he was homesick, and he said he felt blue afterward. After a number of details in which he thanked his mother for the fruitcake and plenty of gum, he told of his visit to the show the other day, and it had such a travelogue of Minnesota showing the spiral bridge at Hastings. You can imagine how blue he felt. This was reproduced in the Hastings Gazette of October 29th, 1943.
A letter home from William Tier in Libya, North Africa. Writing from Libya, North Africa, which he urges should be forcibly given back to the Germans. First Lieutenant William K. Tier, son of Mr. and Mrs. W.L. Tier of Nininger, writes that he has completed 50 missions, presumably over Sicily, Italy, and the North African battlefield, in the Dragon Lady, a wicked-looking and plenty wicked-acting U.S. Air Corps P-38 fighter plane. There are holes in the snoot of the plane that house 50 caliber machine guns, while other powerful weapons are arranged elsewhere. On the matter of the Libyan desert, he wrote, I don't see why they drove the Germans out of here. They ought to have chased them all down here. It's a good place for them. The dust piles up around here as the snow will back there in a couple of months. We still eat okay, so that makes everything okay. Lieutenant Tier also revealed that when his group was still in North Africa, that he had gone hunting a few times and had gotten some quail. They sure tasted good, he wrote. In closing his letter, he wrote, well, as the English chappies say, cheerio as ever, Bill. Hastings Gazette, November 5th, 1943.
A letter Mr. and Mrs. R.C. Allen received during the past week from their son, Private Rodman Allen, tells of the conditions our boys are confronted with in New Guinea. Rodman wrote, I'll try to tell you about some of the things around here. We are situated in a very nice spot. We can be very thankful we don't have to be in the mud. New Guinea is very prominent in disease, combined with mud, slime, rot, stench, sweat, insects, and fever, and now you have New Guinea. You can have it as I don't want it. How God could ever have created anything like this is beyond me. I don't want to sound like I am complaining, for it is the boys in the front lines who have it like that. Those boys deserve all the backing you people back home can give them. I do my own washing in cold water. I get my clothes clean with the help of my willpower and a good bit of elbow grease. There are several here from Minnesota. From the Hastings Gazette, March 24th, 1944.
A letter to Mrs. R.T. Varien of Douglas. The forepart of the week states that her son, Cecil Varien, who is somewhere in England, has been given the rating of private first class. He says that matches over there are rationed, and he wished she might send him a cigarette lighter if such a gadget was to be had. Unfortunately, however, dealers say there are no more lighters being manufactured for the duration. Hastings Gazette, April 21st, 1944. Note, the last few issues of the Gazette have shown collections being taken to send cigarettes to the servicemen as a morale booster. No mention of matches.
A letter from Sergeant Alfred Freiermuth, somewhere in North Africa, to his mother, Mrs. John Freiermuth of St. Paul, formerly of Hastings, tells that he has been transferred from New Guinea to Northern Africa. He is a radio operator, but writes that he had to put his radio paraphernalia aside and help bury the Japs who lay knee-deep on the battlefield. Many of them were women attired in men's uniforms. The heat is terrific, and at times the mercury climbs to 130 degrees. On numerous occasions, he has carried water for many miles in his helmet. He states further that he never was acquainted with real hardships until now, but continues optimistically, "I am pretty rugged and can stand it." He enjoys the Gazette, although sometimes he does not receive any for several months, then a bunch arrive all at once. Hastings Gazette, April 28, 1944. Before our next letter, I'll give you a little background on the Special Service Forces. Properly designated as the 1st Special Service Force, the Devil's Brigade was a joint World War II American-Canadian commando unit trained at Fort Harrison near Helena, Montana. Force members received rigorous and intensive training in stealth tactics, hand-to-hand combat, the use of explosives for demolition, parachuting, amphibious warfare, rock climbing, mountain warfare, and as ski troops. It was at Anzio that the Germans dubbed the 1st Special Service Force the Devil's Brigade. The diary of a dead German soldier contained a passage that said, "The Black Devils, die Schwarzen Teufel, are all around us every time we come into the line." The soldier was referring to them as black because the brigade members smeared their faces with black boot polish for their covert operations in the dark of night. During Anzio, the 1st Special Service Forces fought for 98 days without relief. It was also at Anzio that the 1st Special Service Forces used their trademark stickers. During night patrols, soldiers would carry stickers depicting the unit patch and a slogan written in German which translated to read, "The worst is yet to come." They would place these stickers on German corpses and fortifications to let them know they had been there.
This is from John Hankus in Rome. Word was received by Mr. and Mrs. Charles Hankus from their son, Sergeant John Hankus, paratrooper, shortly before the fall of Rome. In his V-mail letter home, Sergeant Hankus stated that he was fine, but that he was forced to cut his letter short and hoped to be able to tell them why later. Sergeant Hankus, with 4 other Hastings paratroopers, participated in the battle for the Anzio beachhead, according to the letter. He is believed also to have taken part in the capture of Rome. Hastings Gazette, June 9, 1944. Also from John Hankus, place unknown. Only 2 members of the 5 Hastings volunteers who enlisted in the 1st Special Service Force are still making their presence known in the European war area. Staff Sergeant John Hankus, son of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Hankus, and Technician 4th grade Francis Brooke, son of Mr. and Mrs. A.W. Brooke, who are 2 members of the group who are still on active duty. Neither of the men had seen Lieutenant James Moore, recently rumored dead, since the outfit left Italy. In a letter received recently by Mr. and Mrs. Hankus, written September 16th, Staff Sergeant Hankus mentioned that Lieutenant Moore had been killed in action. Sergeant George Hilt, another of the original 5, is based at Vaughan General Hospital in Hines, Illinois, recovering from wounds received in action, and Sergeant Dale Hamilton is in a hospital overseas. Hastings Gazette, October 6, 1944.
Leo Kenney, writing from the Marcus Island. An Associated Press report Saturday told of the rescue from the ocean of Lieutenant Leo T. Kenney, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jerry Kenney of Hastings. A bomb was nestling under the wing of Kenney's plane over Marcus, an island in the South Pacific, when a big anti-aircraft shell crashed into the Hellcat, missing the bomb by a few inches. I thought I'd go down right there, he said, but I got the bomb released. Then fire broke out under the wing and fuselage, and smoke filled the cockpit. I thought I'd lived out my days, but someone must have been praying for me. I cut off the gasoline, and about the time my feet began to get pretty hot, the fire went out. I'd been waiting for the whole plane to explode, but I was trying to get as far from the island as I could before I went down. Cautiously, he cut one gasoline tank on again. The engine caught, but no fire resulted. Still able to handle the crippled plane, he struggled back to the carrier, but even a vicious dive failed to shake the landing wheels down into position. All his dive did was break off a large fragment of the battered, charred wing. Unable to get back aboard the carrier, he pancaked down on the water and scrambled free as his plane sank. A destroyer rescued him. Lieutenant Kenney enlisted in the Naval Air Corps 3 years ago in July. He left for overseas duty in January, and in a letter his parents received from him Monday, the lieutenant said he was at last in combat. No mention was made of his rescue at sea. Lieutenant Kenney is the father of a baby daughter who was born May 22nd in New Bern, North Carolina, where Mrs. Kenney, the former Catherine Jones, is making her home with her parents. This information had apparently not reached Lieutenant Kenney when he wrote his parents. That was from the Hastings Gazette, June 9th, 1944. And in a note, Lieutenant Leo Kenney was killed in action over Saipan 1 month after this letter. On his final mission, he helped destroy 6 Jap aircraft and damaged several others.
Lawrence Lesh, Italy. Private Lawrence Lesh, son of Mr. and Mrs. Frank Lesh, stationed somewhere in Italy, wrote in one of his letters as follows. The eats here are pretty good. In fact, everything is pretty nice here. A person doesn't even realize he's overseas. It's just like being in some camp back in the States. We have free shows and things over here. I sure would like to tell you about my trip over here. It was pretty tiresome, but rather interesting. I'm always traveling. Of course, it's not for pleasure, but someday I'll get a pleasure ride, and that's when I am on the boat on my way back home, at least to the States. Private Lesh is the youngest of 5 brothers in the service, and the first to be sent overseas. 4 of his brothers, Corporal Frank Lesh, Private George Lesh, PFC Robert Lesh, and Private Arnold Lesh, are stationed at various camps throughout the States. Hastings Gazette, August 4th, 1944. Lawrence Lesh, wounded. Private Lawrence Lesh, 19 years old, is the youngest of 5 sons of Mr. and Mrs. Frank Lesh Sr. in the service, has been wounded in action in Italy, according to a V-mail letter the parents received on Tuesday. Written October 13th, Private Lesh, who is in the infantry, in his letter said that he supposed his parents had heard by this time that he had been wounded and received the Purple Heart. He said also that he would send his Purple Heart home. In a hospital, which he spoke of as, quote, nice and warm, dry and peaceful, unquote, Private Lesh said he was pretty tired the day he was hurt of his wounds. He said only that he was able to walk. Hastings Gazette, October 20th, 1944. Lawrence Lesh, Italy. I stepped on a mine and a piece went through my left thigh, and I am back in the hospital again, wrote Private Lawrence Lesh, serving in the infantry with the 5th Army in Italy, in a letter to his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Frank Lesh Sr., received here Wednesday. From his letter, Mr. and Mrs. Lesh think that their son was wounded about April 17th as he entered the hospital that evening and rode home the next day. Private Lesh also said, quote, I can thank God I still have my leg because those mines usually blow off a person's foot or leg. I guess maybe the mine wasn't much good, unquote. Hastings Gazette, April 27th, 1945.
Beth Melby, Camp Upton, Long Island, New York. that her work as a member of the WWII, stationed at the base hospital at Camp Upton, Long Island, New York, is appreciated, is contained in a letter received by the Gazette this week, which lauds PFC Beth Melby, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. J.G. Melby. The letter signed by 4 soldier patients is as follows. August 13th, 1944. To the Hastings Gazette, to the editor. We are a group of patients at the station hospital in Camp Upton, Long Island. We think that the people of Hastings would be pleased to know how grateful we are to a resident of your city, PFC Betty Melby. Detailed to our ward, PFC Melby has made life here much more pleasant by her always cheerful manner and by her many capabilities. We know that we speak not only for ourselves, but for all who have come in contact with her, and we feel that the least we can do is to let her hometown know how much we appreciate her. Sincerely yours, Private R. Leshen, Private T. Cisco, Private Sam J. Quinn, Private Paul P. Virtue. Hastings Gazette, August 18th, 1944.
In his last letter to his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Chris Mayer, Corporal Wilfred Mayer, who was with the U.S. Signal Corps located in New Guinea, sent the following poem. It was entitled, The Night Before Christmas, author unknown. It was the night before Christmas, and through the camp yard, not a creature was stirring except the poor guard. My stockings were stuffed in my shoes to save space, and besides, my tent doesn't have a fireplace. My friend in his shorts and I in my shoes had just settled down for a nice tropic snooze. When out in the area there arose such a clatter that I sprang to my feet to see what was the matter. I became so entangled in my mosquito net that if my friend hadn't helped me, I'd be struggling yet. And then very cautiously I pulled back the flaps, half expecting to see a battalion of Japs. Just imagine my amazement when I saw instead the famous St. Nicholas in his suit of bright red. He sat in his sled, which was pulled by 6 jeeps, and they bounced along gaily in short bounds and leaps. They came to a halt, and away Santa went, and then suddenly he was there in my tent. He was chuckling so merrily that his fat little belly, just like in that other poem, was shaking like jelly. And when I thought sure it was a gag, I noticed his toy sack was a blue barracks bag. But he reached in the bag, and without hesitation, turned to my tent with a pack of K-ration. And then for me, lucky guy that I am, he dug in again and came up with Spam. He followed this quickly with dehydrated potatoes and then produced a can of tomatoes. Then he remarked that he had work to do, so he raised a plump finger and upward he flew. I dashed to the tent flap and was able to see him get in his sled as he waved back to me. "Away, Willis, on forward," was his cry in the night, and in no time at all he was clear out of sight. I still have a laugh when I'm ancient and old at the thought of St. Nick sliding down a tent pole. But that's all there is to it. The story is through. But before I sign off, here's my wish for you. May your Christmas be merry and filled with good cheer. May you be well and happy throughout the new year. Hastings Gazette, December 15th, 1944.
Margaret Primrose, writing from England. The variety of duties which befall the Red Cross worker in her duties overseas is told in a V-mail letter Miss Dorothy Muirhead received this week from a former University of Minnesota classmate, Miss Margaret Primrose, who is with the American Red Cross now somewhere in England. Miss Primrose wrote, "Our duties consist of everything from planning programs and replanning them at the last minute, to wrapping Purple Hearts, to finding people's brothers, to selling Cokes, to finding train schedules, sewing and mending, dancing, making speeches, and about everything else you can think of. I meet hundreds of people each day. Our boys are mostly back from France because of wounds and about to return for the 2nd, 3rd, or even 4th time. The more I see of American fighting men, the more I respect and love them. Wish more of the people back home could realize better what they're going through. I've never known work so completely satisfying or been so happy." Hastings Gazette, December 29th, 1944. Leonard Knoll, writing from Luxembourg. Private Leonard Knoll, in writing his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Anton Knoll of the city, tells of some of the hardships the boys fighting on the Western Front are going through. In a hospital with trench foot following 3 weeks of intense fighting in Luxembourg, Private Knoll wrote that for 3 weeks they had only K rations for food. No one was able to shave or wash, and before he could shave, he had to cut off his whiskers with the scissors, the soldier stated. He also said that during those 3 weeks, he laid in the snow. But Private Knoll writes, "The worst part of it is to see your buddies next to you killed, and there is nothing you can do about it." Hastings Gazette, January 12th, 1945.
Rodman Allen in the Philippines. The Allens received their first letter Wednesday from their son since he arrived in the Philippines. Rodman said, "The first 2 days we stayed in a church, a very beautiful one too. We got in at night and rolled our blankets out on a hard stone floor and slept. We are right in the middle of town, something entirely new to us after being in New Guinea jungles for 19 months. The civilians treat us awfully good. They would give us anything they had, but they are so short and in need of everything. I guess the Japs really treated them terrible. I hate to think of the untold agony they went under the heel of the Yellow Devils. Everybody speaks very good English. The little children have captured the hearts of all of us. Their eyes have seen some pretty horrible sights, too. It's interesting to hear them tell of when the Japs were here. The women here are very beautiful, too. You should see them as they come to church dressed in their Spanish costumes. Old Spanish lace seems to be the all-around favorite. There seems to be a never-ending line going and coming to church all the time. Please include the Philippine people in your prayers. They are absolutely the most courageous people I have ever met." Hastings Gazette, January 26, 1945.
A letter from Edward Bill Bloomstrand, 1944. Dear Mom, we left Camp Pendleton Saturday and pulled out of the harbor that afternoon. We have been having fair chow on this ship. I was kind of lucky we didn't get a regular troop transport, so we aren't very crowded. We have exercise every day, and we have another rifle inspection tomorrow. Other than that, we have the time to ourselves. The day before yesterday, we went through a Red Cross canteen line. They gave everybody a carton of cigarettes, 5 candy bars, a book, shoestring, soap, and container, and writing material, which we thought was very nice of them. I don't know for sure where we will get off, but I do know the ship's first stop, and I suppose we'll get off. I was a little dizzy the first morning. Other than that, we haven't been at all seasick. We have to go to bed at 9 o'clock, and the lights don't go on again till 6 a.m. Well, that's about all for now. Love, Bill. Then on March 16th, 1945, a Western Union telegram. Mr. and Mrs. Albert Bloomstrand, 316 and a half East 2nd Street, Hastings, Minnesota. Deeply regret to inform you that your son, Private First Class Edward A. Bloomstrand, USMC, was killed in action 19 February 1945 at Iwo Jima, Volcanic Island, in the performance of his duty and the service of his country. When information is received regarding burial, you will be notified. To prevent possible aid to our enemies, do not divulge the name of a ship or station. Please accept my heartfelt sympathy letter as follows. A. Vandergrift, Lieutenant General, USMC, Commandant of the Marine Corps. I remember that day that telegram came. I was 10 years old, and they called our house to make sure that my mother and father were home. I'm sure my mother and father knew what was coming, a telegram, because they knew he was on Iwo Jima. So anyway, my mother and father were in the front room, and I was looking out the window, kind of waiting for the telegram to come. And it was a 1942 Ford white car pulled up in front of the house, and a man and woman came into the house. They came in and they read the telegram. I suppose they said condolences. I don't remember that. But they gave the telegram to my mother and father. Then they left. And then my father, he went off to grieve by himself. My mother, she went off to grieve. And I was standing in the front room all alone. And I was pretty traumatized. But anyway, it wasn't long. My mother came back, and she comforted me. And then people started coming to the house. Hastings was a very small town, and word really got around quick. So then we had a memorial service for him at our church, and we got a letter from the government. They said that if we wanted his body back home, my father had to pay for the transportation to bring it home. Well, my father didn't have that kind of money, so he was buried on Iwo Jima. Well, then after the war, about 2 years, maybe 47, 48, they decided they wanted all them bodies off of Iwo Jima. So they sent his body back to Hastings. So then we had a funeral at the Guarding Angels Church, and I'd like to say this about with this Veterans Day is coming up. The veteran community in Hastings, the VFW and the American Legion, they took over that funeral. They were the pallbearers and the memorial squad, and they just really took over. And I know my parents really appreciated that. And he was taken to Fort Snelling, buried up there with military service, and we were all glad to have our brother and son back in Minnesota. And it kind of gave us closure then.
Reverend Ladislaus Sledz, former instructor at St. Paul's Seminary, one of my deans back in the 50s. He's a brother of Reverend Henry Sledz, former assistant pastor of Guardian Angels Church in Hastings. He has chosen to remain a prisoner in a German prison camp, though he could have returned on the exchange ship, the Grips home. It has been revealed, according to an article in the St. Paul Pioneer Press. His refusal to come home was for 2 reasons, according to a letter just received by his mother, Mrs. Mary Sledz. First, he did not want to leave his fellow prisoners, many of them boys he knew, in northeast Minneapolis. So he did not want to leave them without a chaplain. And second reason for refusal, they'd have no one to talk to about baseball and football. The 47-year-old priest was a graduate of the College of St. Thomas, ordained in St. Paul's Seminary, where he later taught history. In 1933, he went to Poland to do historical research at WWII, the oldest university in Europe. Hastings Gazette, February 23, 1945. I also know that the soldier that opened the prison gates at Dachau was a former student of his at the seminary.
With the 6th Armored Division in Germany, First Lieutenant Nick McGree, son of M.V. McGree of Hastings, and his platoon of B Company, 44th Armored Infantry Battalion, went into action recently. They didn't stop until they had captured a few score of Germans, liberated 35 slave laborers, and unearthed an arsenal of rifles and machine guns. Not long after his column jumped off, they were stopped by a covered roadblock. Under cover of darkness, Lieutenant McGree surrounded the suspected area and in short order eliminated the block and took 3 anti-tank guns with their crews intact. When word came that Nazi bazooka men were threatening the column from the flanking position, Lieutenant McGree's platoon went forward and captured the Nazis. Early the next morning, Lieutenant Bob Conover, Berkeley, California, and Lieutenant McGree approached a house which had been reportedly heavily fortified. A German came out and meekly surrendered as they stood before the house and assured them there wasn't anyone inside. But Lieutenant McGree entered and called, "Hans Bosch." He repeated the command, and soon 35 grinning slave laborers singing out "Ruskies" came trooping out, followed by 2 German women. He searched the rest of the house and found an arsenal of rifles and machine guns in a cellar dugout. As the crew returned to rejoin their column, they were augmented by more than a score of French and Mongol workers, as well as a handful of German soldiers who came out of the nearby woods. Hastings Gazette, April 27, 1945.
Matt Niska, Germany. A factual picture of the brutality and bestiality in a Nazi concentration camp is told in a censored letter written by T3 Matt Niska, who was employed in the office of the Lund Ski Company before he entered the service in December 1942. Niska is with an intelligence division, and since going overseas during the summer of 1943, he participated in the invasion of Normandy and has been at the front in France and Germany. The letter to Bert Flagstead, also of the Lund Company here in Hastings, he was part of their office staff, and whom T3 Matt Niska has been corresponding to regularly. Germany, 22nd April 1945. Dear Bert, I usually don't have much that I can write about, but today there is plenty. I visited a German concentration camp that was in operation until April 11, when it was overrun by the American Army. On April 1st, there were 82,000 prisoners. With the approach of our forces, the Germans began moving them and succeeded in evacuating all but 22,000, who are still there, being cared for by the United States. The camp is in the woods between Weimar and Buchenwald. Driving out of Weimar, the four of us, passed through a beautiful forest. Then, rounding a curve, suddenly came upon a camp in a stark, treeless space comprising approximately 50 acres. Most of the buildings are in rows, wooden, 1 story in height, surrounded by a high wire fence, doubled with the inner fence being wired for electricity to prevent escape. We entered the gate and walked around for a while, staring in consternation at the emancipated living skeletons slowly going about their seemingly pointless business. We entered one of the barracks and soon discovered it was a hospital. Some of the patients could move about. Others could just move their heads and smile a small welcome. Even those who could walk were so thin that their joints stuck out like knobs. It was incredible that their thin pipe stem legs could carry them. The whole purpose of the camp was the extermination of the majority of the inmates. For the most part, this was accomplished through slow starvation and diseases brought on by insufficient food. 2 of the strongest offered to guide us to the camp, and we gladly accepted. They could both speak English. One was an Austrian, having been a lawyer, and the other a Frenchman who had been a doctor. Both had been in the French army, had been imprisoned by the Germans because of their anti-Nazi beliefs and activities. They had been into various concentration camps for 4 years. The Frenchman had been tortured by the Nazis, the fingers of his right hand, having been misshapen and crooked, had been broken many times, a couple of them in 2 places. All I write in this letter was either shown to us or told us by these 2 men, so they can be accepted as a gospel truth. The Nazis made a practice of exterminating the better educated of their political enemies or their professional men. And if they were Jewish, well, suited their purpose that much better. An average of 5,000 people a month died of starvation, disease, or from a more violent death by hanging, shooting, or beating. Next, we went into the barracks, where the inmates were having a meal. Near the table was a garbage can. Our guides told us that 2 weeks ago, garbage was never seen. The prisoners just didn't have any. Eating even the crumbs, plus the garbage the Nazi SS guards threw out. Next, we went to a barracks where the children, up to 15 years of age, had been. The place stunk like a pigsty. Wooden platforms the length of the room and about 10 feet out from the walls had been built on both sides. There were 4 decked affairs, that is, 4 platforms with a space of about 2 feet between them, one over the other. The uprights separated them into sections. Each compartment measured approximately 10 by 10 feet. In each one of these, 12 children slept. With 4 layers, that meant that in a space of 10 by 10 feet, by about 7 feet high, 48 children slept. Our Austrian guide informed us that when he first arrived there, he was in a barracks that housed about 2,000. Some, or rather about 10%, died every day. With the starvation diet, the prisoners became so apathetic and unknowing that sometimes a live person slept next to a dead person for days without knowing whether he was dead until he started to smell. The allowance of food per day, for the most part, was a half-inch thick slice of dark bread and a liter of thin soup, about 3/4 of a quart. Next, we went to the crematorium. Outside the door, piled up like cord wood, were the nude, dead bodies of some 50 or 60 of what the Nazis choose to call the enemies of the better way of living. Next to them, still piled on a wagon, were the bodies of a like number. The place stunk like to high heaven. And since they had been there from the time the Germans pulled out, not having had the time to dispose of them. Since the camp was established in 1937, inmates have died there. So long, Matt. Hastings Gazette, May 25th, 1945.
About 45 Kiwanians and their guests heard a first-hand account of the reception given to American men and women giving stage shows sponsored by the USO in the China, Burma, India theater of war. Miss Rosemary Volin, introduced as a 20-year-old girl who had spent 7 months in the CBI theater and much traveled for one so young, gave a most moving account of the reception given her unit of 5 girls in U.S. camp stage show. At one place in Assam, India, they traveled by the only route on cattle cars on a railroad for 5 days to find 14 GIs who had been there for about 2 years and had not seen a person from the outside, and especially an American girl, for more than that time. The girls were given a welcome that lasted for 15 minutes, she said. They were so happy they had tears in their eyes, she said, and to show their appreciation of the birthday of one of the members of the camp show, the mess sergeant sat up all night to bake a cake, and it had the message, "Welcome 2069, our number," along with the names of each girl sketched in the frosting. Miss Volin spoke very earnestly on the tremendous strain the boys from the States were undergoing in the battle in the heat and humidity of the China, Burma, India theater. They not only have to face the declared enemy, but that other and more dreaded enemy, disease, dirt, and boredom. These can do more to recommend spirit than anything we can imagine. Miss Volin concluded her talk with an urgent request that the home folks must put extra effort into the war effort and not let the boys down for 1 minute. Hastings Gazette, May 25th, 1945.
Jacob Worth from the Philippine Islands. From the Philippine Islands, where he is stationed at the 133rd General Hospital, Private First Class Jacob J. Worth, son of Mr. and Mrs. Henry Worth, Sr. of Hastings, has sent an editorial written by the late Ernie Pyle, husband of the former Geraldine Seabolds of Hastings. Ernie Pyle, who was killed in the South Pacific. PFC Worth asked that the editorial, which was printed in the Reader's Digest, be reprinted in the Gazette, quote, just as a reminder, end quote. The editorial follows. This fall, I came home from France on a ship that carried 1,000 of our wounded American soldiers. About a fourth of them were terribly wounded stretcher cases. The rest were up and about. These others could walk, though among the walking were many legs and arms missing, many eyes that could not see. One hospitalized soldier was near death on this trip. He was wounded internally, and the Army doctors were trying desperately to keep him alive until we got to America. They kept pouring plasma and whole blood into him constantly until they ran out of whole blood. I happened to be in the head doctor's cabin at noon one day. He said that other doctors at that moment were going around the ship typing blood specimens from several of the ship's officers and from unwounded officers aboard. They were doing this surreptitiously, for they didn't want it to get out that they needed blood. Why didn't they want it to get out? Because if it had, there would have been a stampede to the hospital ward by the other wounded men, offering their blood to this dying comrade. Think of that, a stampede of men themselves badly wounded, wanting to give their blood. Hastings Gazette, June 15, 1945.
Hastings celebrates the end of the war with noise, parades, and prayer. All businesses halted Wednesday following word from the president. Hastings lost no time in joining other communities of the state and nation Tuesday night in staging a victory celebration which began almost immediately after the news of Japan's surrender to the Allied forces came a few minutes after 6 p.m. in an announcement by President Harry Truman. The city fire siren was the first to announce the news locally. Other shrieking whistles in various parts of the city, honking automobile horns soon followed suit. An impromptu parade of some 20 youngsters, each banging away at some sort of noisemaker, brought a crowd of merrymakers to 2nd Street. The city band, hurriedly called together, played a program of patriotic music in front of the armory. Churches in the city were opened to those wishing to pray, a number having special services. All evening celebrators flocked to the city taverns and restaurants, happy and hilarious, but in good order. Wednesday was observed as a full holiday in the city, with all the industrial plants, stores, public offices, cafes, and gasoline stations closed. The King Midas Mill shut down, also Hudson, Smead, Lund, and Bronson factories, giving employees a holiday. At noon, the Hastings Post Office closed, not to reopen until Friday morning. Hastings Gazette, August 17, 1945.
From Gerald Rohr and Harold Mueller, Okinawa. Many Hastings boys in service were in the typhoon area when the storm struck Okinawa early in October of this year. Private Gerald Rohr, son of Mr. and Mrs. P.J. Rohr in Washington County, who with his unit were on Okinawa just ready to ship out to Korea, writes, "They got us down to the beach and learned that the typhoon was coming. So they brought us back to camp. Sunday night it started to blow. Then Monday morning about 3, we got up and started to work on our tent to hold it down. But by noon, the storm was so bad that rations were issued for 2 meals, and we were told to take to the hills. There were 6 of us from my tent, and we found an empty Jap pillbox that we crawled in for the night. If you have heard anything about Jap pillboxes, you know what that night was like. The tombs are square blocks of cement dug into the side hill. Some of the boys were lucky. They found one with only a couple of skeletons in it. All the ones we looked at were full of skeletons. What a person won't do when they just have to. Some of the fellows who waited until dark to leave camp could hardly get down the hill, as the wind was blowing about 100 miles an hour. Some of the boys were blown down and badly cut up, and today we were over 50 men short. We came back to camp on Wednesday morning to get ourselves some rations from the mess hall, but everything was blown about. After getting something to eat, we started to fix up something for over our heads, as the biggest share of the tents were ripped to pieces. A bunch of us had made ourselves a little lean-to against an old foundation and covered it with pieces of old tent. When we crawled into it at night, it leaked like a sieve. Boy, it sure is a mess around here. Hastings Gazette, November 2, 1945.
Joe Daly, England. An interest and possibly a correspondence has started up between the old-time historic city of Hastings, England, and Hastings, Minnesota. The reason for the interest in the American town appears to have been the expedition of Sergeant Joe Daly of Hastings, Minnesota, to see the sights of Hastings, England, while in England, which visit was given considerable notice in both of the city's daily newspapers, the Hastings and St. Leonard's Observer, a morning newspaper, and the Evening Argus. Sergeant Joe Daly, U.S. Army of Hastings, Minnesota, a town of 6,000 people on the mighty Mississippi, came here on Saturday to see what the historic Hastings was like, and to use his own words, was treated like a king. You are grand people here. Your mayor received me in his parlor at the town hall. I was introduced to your borough treasurer and your borough engineer, and I was taken to see the sights of your fine town, including William the Conqueror's castle, your lovely Alexandria Park, the White Rock Baths and the bathing pool, and the underground car parks, which I think are a very good idea. I want to come back again someday and see some more of your town and neighborhood. In our town on the Mississippi, we have a woman mayor, Mrs. Vernon Truax, and I know she will be delighted to hear of the splendid welcome you have given me in your English Hastings. From the Evening Argus, Hastings, Minnesota is a prosperous little manufacturing and agricultural town of some 6,000 inhabitants. Lying on the Mississippi River, it proudly boasts of being the only town in the world with a spiral bridge, actually a straight bridge across the river with a spiral staircase at each end. Hastings Gazette, December 14th, 1945. We wanted to end our program tonight by telling you what happened to these men whose letters you've just heard. We thought we would be able to find biographical information about each of them, but some of them we just couldn't trace. We did, however, find the following veterans. Ed Bloomstrand died on Iwo Jima in February of 1945. Alfred Freiermuth returned from the war, married, and became an avid gardener. He passed away in 2003. John Hankus, who served in the Devil's Brigade, returned to Hastings to live, and in February of 2015, he traveled to Washington, D.C. to receive the Congressional Gold Medal. John P. Karpen returned to Hastings and served 2 terms as Dakota County Superintendent of Schools. He died in November of 1978. Leo Kenney was killed in action over Saipan in July of 1944. Leonard Knoll was employed by the Milwaukee Road and Hudson for several years. He died in 1966. Lawrence Lesh was employed by the telephone company for many years in Stockton, California. He died in May of 1973. Bernie McCoy came back to Hastings, where he was a mail carrier for many years. He was also a Boy Scout leader in Hastings for 43 years. He died in March of 2003. Nick McGree remained in the Air Force for 23 years, then came back to Minnesota to work at 3M. He died in November 2005. Thank you all for your attention tonight. We hope you enjoyed your program on the evening before Veterans Day 2015. Remember to thank any veterans you encounter tomorrow. We invite you to look at the artifacts and at the table and the book of letters. And Mr. Bert Goderstedt has said that he has a few comments he'd like to give you.
Thank you, Sydney. Thank you, Beth, for your service. I want to tell you about my brother, oldest brother, Nels, who was in the Navy. And he went in the Navy in 41. And on December 7th, 1941, we were at my uncle and aunt's house. My brother had come home for leave. He had been at Great Lakes training camp in Chicago, and he had come home for my folks' 25th wedding anniversary. And we were at my aunt and uncle's house in McFarland, Wisconsin, for dinner on December 7th. And on the way home came that awful announcement on the radio that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. We had not heard from my brother, and we didn't know where he was. And we didn't hear for a couple of weeks. My mother cried all the way home, and I think for 2 months she must have, cried herself to sleep. But we finally heard that he was at Fort Remington, Washington, and had been shipped out, and he was on a hospital ship in all those battles of the Saipan and all those, Iwo Jima and all of them in a hospital ship. A kamikaze plane just missed his boats, and he got home okay. But he told a story about when they were helping the people move out of concentration camps in China. The Chinese would come with their little boats and want a cigarette. So the Navy sailors would throw down a cigarette and they would throw up a package of firecrackers, and the sailors would light the firecrackers and throw them back down at the Chinese. That was awful that they would do that. But wanted you to know, on the letters, most of my letters, or the letters that my folks got from my oldest brother, they were kind of clipped apart, You couldn't tell people where you were. They were censored. And my brother figured out one of them, that as a kid, I was about 8 or 10 years old, I used to go to the neighbors to get eggs in a basket. And his name was Cy Slick. And my brother wrote, remember when Buddy used to go to Cy's with a pan to get eggs? Well, we knew he'd been at Saipan. So, because I always used a basket to get the eggs so they wouldn't roll around in a pan. Anyway, thank you again. And it was a great event. Thank you, Cindy and Shirley, for organizing this. And thank you, Beth, for your service.